Would you mind introducing yourself to start?
Hi, my name is Anya Kamenetz. I'm a journalist and an author of several books about education, and I write the Substack, The Golden Year. I'm sorry, and I write the Substack, The Golden Hour.
hmm Um, so you live in New York, right?
Yes, in Brooklyn.
So yeah, I mean, I'm New England born and raised, so I feel somewhat culturally obligated to ask you how the weather is today.
We had a pretty good winter. We've had a bit of snow, and there was some more snow this week. Today, the sun came out, so it's kind of nice.
Yeah, I live in California now, and people don't talk about the weather really. It's just not a topic. Something
Yeah,
has to happen for the weather to be a topic.
yeah,
In
yeah,
the
sure.
Northeast, it's just like a daily topic. It's an hourly
Mhm.
topic in the Northeast. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
your Substack is great, and it touches on all these different interests you have and areas of expertise. Why did you name it the Golden Hour?
So this is a phrase that I really love because it has a bunch of different valences to it. I mean, if you're a photographer, you know about the most beautiful time, right, of dawn and of dusk, when it's great to shoot, when the light is amazing, but it's also a very fleeting moment. Um, and that relates to me to, in the one sense, the really critical period of our children's development, the time that they're not going to get back, as well as the crucial moment. So when I went to do um, hostile environment training for NPR, when they sent me to Ukraine, in trauma medicine, they also use the phrase the golden hour, and they mean that window of time after a traumatic, violent event where you can save a life. So that idea of a fleeting, precious, high stakes moment that we're living in is really what I wanted to evoke.
Hmm. And really addresses so many of the different areas that you work in and think about. And we could talk about education, we could talk about AI, we could talk about climate change, but I wonder to what extent, when we talk about any of those things, we're just talking about capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair and a very powerful, I think, lens or framework to use when you talk about the systems that have been put in place: corporate capitalism, extractivism, legacy of imperialism and colonialism. Different levels of subjugation of groups of people. These are important frames, and they explain a lot.
What's your sense of our relationship with the mechanisms of capitalism? I'm using our here in the most broad sense, but you do talk to a lot of people, you interact with a lot of different people in your work. What's your sense of how Americans feel, understand capitalism?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So you could answer that question in so many different ways. One lens that I think is powerful to put on it is to think about the amount of time that we give to, sort of loosely speaking, market versus non-market activities, right? And so that would include, the unpaid work, the out of market work is care work, right? It's kinship work. It's caring for children. It's caring for yourself. It's all the things that we do to have healthy relationships so we can keep going. Mental health. It's spiritual work. It's going, maintaining communities, and none of those things are respected by the market. None of them are counted by the market. People who engage in those things, if their paid work overlaps with care duties, if they're in education, if they're in social work, they're paid less. So there's a real sense that we don't know how to value those things, and we don't know how to value anything except by counting it. But in a more optimistic sense, when you look at your day and you look at your life and you look at what's really meaningful, for most of us, it's not the paying activities that we engage in or the consumption that we engage in of things. It's this very realm of life that capitalism doesn't know how to touch, and therefore it doesn't really touch.
There's so many lessons to education, what you just said, the power of measurement or the abuse of measurement,
Yeah.
and what truly can be measured. But I was thinking about, I think his name is David Lionheart, in the New York Times had an article recently about how despite the continued growth of the US economy, most measurements of quality of life continue to drop.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that. And I know you've written a bit about, or a lot about, the paltry amount that the US spends on pre K
Yeah.
education, and that seems to fit into that discussion.
It really does. I mean, there's different ways of measuring quality of life that we don't necessarily spend a lot of time doing. But for my, there's been a long history of research that has confirmed and underlined again and again that the years from 0 to 5 are the most important in some ways in a person's life, and that is really the time where investments in communities and in families and in institutions can do the most. And the fact that we don't respect that and we don't begin, public free education until pre-K level. I mean, expanding it down to pre-K has been an achievement and has been a very good thing. But it sort of shows that we're not really willing to make the investments where they really count. Um, and I think we see that across the board in uh, there's been a very strong political movement for decades in American society that has successfully argued that anything that we hold in common is somehow going to take away our freedom. And that's been, I think, really detrimental.
Do you think that lack of attention on early childhood is a characteristic of our system or a bug in our system? And do you think that our our relationship with our capitalist system, but also our view of what it means to support and be more socialistic, do you think that in a way we are, the word doomed is too strong, but do we get to a place where we really value those early years?
Um, for me, what's hard coded is the tension around the role of women and the role of men and the role of home and the role of work, right? So the stress about whether we're going to have a collective care for children and babies, that is stressful because there are always factions within society who say, well, that is a mother's job. And we need to set up society to that so that mothers can stay home with their children and control that environment. And, there's many different, there's sort of a trad wife version of that where it's really about, a completely patriarchal and imaginary traditionalist, right, idea. But then there's a different kind. I mean, there's a crunchy sort of left wing version of that, which is about attachment parenting and having the child next to you, constantly and never having any child care because you're showing your devotion and your complete, um, abnegation of your own needs for the sake of the child. And I think that's something that has also gone in a little bit. It's become more ideological than it is really listening to what the collective needs. But we have a lot of trouble in America negotiating between those things. And I think as someone who has children of her own, I've been on different sides of that tension myself. It hurts sometimes to go to work and leave your child, even in a great childcare. It also hurts sometimes to be, elbowed out of opportunities because you're being, placed in a situation where you're torn between different responsibilities. And so it's uncomfortable no matter what we do. But the way that we care for children continues to be sort of tossed on these ideological horns, right, of this dilemma as people work out their own individual as well as collective conflicts about what the proper role is, when the reality is that there is no one. I mean, we need to be able to solve this in a way that allows for individual freedom of choice without making value judgments, as long as we decide collectively that we're going to put the children's needs first.
We have such a strange relationship with collective in this country.
Yeah.
I think you just said that so nicely, the individual choice, but then there's also systemic considerations that require collective action. If you don't mind me asking,
Yeah.
when you reflect back on your own early years, as far back as we can kind of remember our early childhood,
Yeah.
what stands out to you about how you were raised as a young child?
Wow. So you know, pertinent to what we're talking about, my parents both worked in the same English department of the same university. So they had relatively like equal arrangement. And they really had to, they didn't have family nearby. So it was daycares, preschools. Sometimes their graduate students would babysit. I was cared for by the wife of another faculty member alongside her children. And so they made it work in a whole bunch of different ways. I think in terms of the kind of parenting that I got as a young child, my parents were teachers. They were in love with English literature and they were enthralled with the learning and developing brain. I mean, so the happiest moments of my early childhood had to do with sort of discovering the world and being witnessed by my parents in that discovery and their kind of excitement as I encountered nature, encountered books, art and different things. So yeah, I think that delight, and that's something I get to see now with my children and their grandparents. They still have that same kind of um, delight in the child's brain.
Mm. Yeah, the things that we can provide for our children just by what we do, what we have around is really powerful. My
Mhm.
mom was a teacher. My dad worked for a newspaper. And so, same idea,
Mm,
the things that were sort of always around, um, particularly newspapers. We're such a newspaper family. I only realized later that wasn't really the norm. I mean, certainly
yeah.
by like, the 90s. Um, do you like how decentralized American education is? Not to swerve too much here, but to,
Yeah. Um, well, I'll say this, Dan, at the moment with the federal threats, it feels like a good idea. I'm
yeah.
glad that there's so much local control because it's going to whatever we go through in this current political cycle. I feel like there will be something on the other end of it because we have this very distributed model.
Mm,
Um, when I think about America and the way that we actually unified behind the idea of public, universal, free public education for everyone, even for immigrants, it seems like a miracle that we got that together and they were able to establish that as a known idea in so many different kinds of places. And even after decades of attacks on public education, we still have, I just checked the other day, 90% of children are in public schools. Um, so, and I'm including charter schools there, but not private and not homeschool. So I think it's a pretty, the common characteristics of the system are what really stand out to me. I think arguably, if you look at other countries, you can imagine higher educational standards if we had more standardization and perhaps elevation of how we train teachers and how we vet curricula and materials. All of that could be a lot more, I think, better done on a national basis if we look at countries like Canada or Japan. However, uh, there's we are very different from a lot of countries, and so
mm.
it's sort of hard to make a one-to-one comparison.
Yeah. How much does our multiculturalism play into that, do you think?
Hugely, hugely. I mean, there's 100 languages spoken just in the New York City public schools.
Right. Yeah. And yet we continue to want to measure.
Yeah.
We continue to want to report and display progress through numbers. And how does that, to what extent does our obsession with measurement hold us back from um, a lot of human potential in schools?
Well, I mean, in my book, The Test, my argument is that the standardized test regime really is stopping our schools from moving to meet the moment and to evolve in the way that they need to because they are really an antique technology. I mean, standardization is a product of the industrial age of the 19th century, where every student is supposed to give the same answer to a test, to any question, any item. And as long as we go for cheap machine gradable tests, we're going to have sort of cheap learning to go with it. Um, the reinvention of schools of education, the reorientation around different kinds of metrics, is a project that's underway in fits and starts. I don't think I've never met a teacher who's totally complacent about the way that we do these things now. And I think that most schools and most school leaders would tell you that they're trying to introduce multiple measures. And in fact, I mean, I think that's true in the sense that you see school leaders putting emphasis on things like attendance and things like student satisfaction, or even kind of fuzzier measures around, school climate, those types of things, which are really important and create the container for learning. Um, but there are other practices like in portfolio schools, in having teachers from different schools look at student work and compare and create a common measurement. That doesn't Those practices don't seem to spread because they're much more labor intensive and we don't reward them or recognize them.
Yeah, I feel like we are struggling to simplify in schools.
Yeah.
There's always more information, more ideas, more ways of doing things. But I think in schools, in my experience, we're not very good at taking things out. So more
Yes.
gets added, but we don't take anything out. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I teach eighth grade, so I see just the wonderful, crazy creativity of adolescents every day,
Yeah.
and yet often feel like that we are doing the exact opposite so often of harnessing that because of accountability, because of new pressures to do this, to add this new measurement tool, or to try this new way of organizing the day or this new curriculum. And
Yeah.
how do we find that space, that middle ground where we can let kids be kids
Hmm.
with the caveat that as public schools, there has to be some accountability to the public, and
Hmm.
that's a balancing act that I feel like we're not doing a great job of right now. But I'd be curious if you think differently.
I don't think that we're doing a great job. I do think that the shock of COVID did force a realignment in a number of different ways. One is that, it sort of, the music stopped, right? And people had to sort of reevaluate what they were doing because business as usual was not there anymore. And even in that spring of 2020, when you saw schools sort of lift graduation requirements, or colleges get rid of SAT scores, it was like, well, what are we doing and why are we doing it? Is it really the most important thing here? And every single teacher that I know rediscovered the importance of relationships in keeping students engaged in school. If the students don't have trust, they don't have a reason to come back or the reason to show up or the reason to turn their Zoom camera on. They need to have an attachment to the school and to the mission of the school and to their fellow students and to their teachers. Otherwise, it's not going to succeed. And I know that there's been, we've rushed back without a real mourning period, without a real recognition of what was lost, of what was forgotten. And that part is very, very painful. And I know that teachers feel, the ones that I've talked to feel very, they were put right back under pressure and under stress, and we have to catch up and we have to keep going. But I also think that there's a lingering, and I wonder how you feel about this. There's a lingering memory of, actually, no, what's really important is that my students are not depressed, that they're able to be together, and their emotional well-being is actually the North Star.
Yeah, the focus on mental health, student mental health that COVID brought about is certainly one of the lasting legacies. We, I know, like where I am now, are keep having kids together in school is the most important thing. Where we can talk later a bit about the fires we had here in Los Angeles, and
Yeah.
that put us out of school for a while. But it also made it difficult for students to get to school if they live in the
Yeah.
affected area, and just the way the traffic is going. And there's students in Malibu and
Yeah.
Topanga that are just getting to LA is difficult. But
Mhm.
it's such a we're realizing the lesson from COVID is it's really important that they get to school. We figure
Yeah.
out a way to make it happen because, as you said, the learning is not going to happen
Yeah.
on that deep level, the where the emotions are, if they can't be together and they can't feel safe. And
Yeah.
I know you, teen mental health is first and foremost for you. I know, and I um, when you talk to teachers, how are, what's your sense of where kids are, as we're, I feel like we're at this point now where there's this sort of thing where in schools we would say, okay, I think this was the last class that was really affected by COVID. And they go on,
Mhm.
well, how are they doing? Well, I don't know. This might be the last class that was really
Mhm.
impacted by COVID. When I think we're probably just sort of, being a little bit, um, we're playing a little games here because everybody was impacted by COVID. But I wonder, what
Yeah.
have you kind of picked up in your own conversations?
I mean, another way of looking at that is that the baseline might have really shifted in terms of, on a whole community level. And I mean, I knew at the very beginning of the COVID shutdowns, looking at the research, that it would be a generational impact. It impacts every child, the ones that are in utero on up, and so that wave is going to continue to proceed. But as it does, our expectations shift. Our beliefs about what can or should be done within a school year shifts, and that's why some people reported this mismatch between how teachers say kids are doing and what parents perceive, because again, their baseline, their expectations have shifted. If there's a lot of kids in your kindergarten class who aren't reading, then that becomes the new normal. And perhaps it's returning to the normal of a generation ago, because we have had a creep up of the purely academic standards, right, in terms of expectations on our youngest kids. But in terms of like how the kids are doing, I have an eighth grader also, and he's been really resilient, but he's also had his ups and downs. And the normalization of mental health conversations is overwhelmingly, I think, a good thing. Um, but people like Lisa Damore, who I really respect, adolescent
Mhm,
psychologist,
mhm,
she says sometimes, there's such a thing as too much feelings talk, and there's such a thing as sort of like, if you're nervous about a test, it's not the same thing as having clinical anxiety. And do we have a discourse that is empowering kids with understanding themselves, understanding their conditions, having a passion for other people? Or do we have a discourse that's tilting toward pathologizing the normal ups and downs of
mhm,
being an adolescent and foregrounding your emotional sort of experiences in the moment to moment at the expense of perhaps other goals? And the one thing I try to always just incorporate is that part of the mental health function of schools is experiences of efficacy and overcoming challenge, right? And so the warm, demanding
mhm.
school that gives you a lot to think about, a lot to be curious about, a way to achieve, is also part of how schools are healing.
Yeah, you can definitely overdo it. I mean, we came back from after the fires.
Yeah.
I think one of the greatest things was our head of school said, we got together as a
Yeah.
community, and he told the staff ahead of time, faculty ahead of time, said, we're going to get together as a community. I'm going to say some words. I'm going to let students say some words, and then that's it. I don't
Hmm.
want to hear that you're bringing it up in class. Obviously, a
Hmm.
student needs to talk about it. That's different, but we're moving on. And
Yeah.
that's what students wanted. They
Yeah.
want to get back to learning. They don't want to, as you say, they don't want to turn this into a clinical study of their feelings at that every moment of the
Yeah.
day. But you also, you said this somewhere, that this idea of kids being resilient and
Hmm.
resilience and grit and perseverance, and we
Yeah.
want all those things in children. But if we're expecting students to have that, but they don't have the network, the
Yeah.
safety network, then there's a disconnect there, and COVID did reveal some of that, right?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I mean, the resilience, I compare it to, right, to grass, which bounces back up, but that's because it has this underground network of very thick roots that keep it fed and keep it nourished. And yeah, that's really what we need to be constantly building and reinforcing for our kids. And it's really interesting that you bring up the fires, because I think that what we're also seeing, and I co-wrote a paper kind of arguing this, that the interruptions of climate change and extreme weather are getting more and more frequent all over the world. And um, when interruption becomes a norm, it shifts how you approach the entire school project, because the school itself has to be resilient. right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't count on having 180 days in the order that you expected them to. And in some ways, it's like another blow against the sort of traditionalist standardized version of education where it's day 5 of week 10 and we're teaching this, right? You need to be it. It needs to work very differently in this in the circumstances.
100%. I mean, I think the teachers that are nimble and can respond to student needs and the ebbs and flows of the year and the week are the most successful. And then you could just take that out to the school view. Schools need to be organic and responsive. But that climate change, originally I did contact you because I was thinking a lot about climate change and how
Yeah,
schools talk about it. And back
yeah,
to this idea of resilience and the network. And I
yeah,
just been feeling a lot, even before the fires, that, kids are inundated with climate change, doomsdayism, right?
yeah,
And social media and in the media. And I
yeah,
just don't feel like schools take it that seriously. And I
yeah,
don't know if it's just because climate change feels so big that schools don't want to touch it, or because our curriculum is already overstuffed. Like as I was saying, we don't take anything out; we just put things in.
yeah,
And there are programs out there that can help schools address climate change, but by and large, you don't see. I mean, even as an example here, New Jersey recently was the
yeah.
first state, but I'm reading an article about it, and the article even said something like New Jersey seeks to address climate change in the classroom, even in classes, even in surprising classes like social studies and art. Like that's not surprising.
Right.
Climate change is not just a science topic, and I think schools uh, either see it that way or maybe just don't even want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, so, I'll just say like, this is a huge paradigm shift. And I've had some people tell me that they think it's the most exciting movement in education because it is not just a content area, it is a mindset shift. And obviously, I mean, climate change, one term for it is that it's a hyper object, which means it's so big, it envelops everything. It is the jar of honey, and we are the wasps climbing around in it, right? We can't get away from it. And uh, there's no way it's going to fit into one science lesson in middle school, right? It permeates everything, including whether or not you can even come to school in the first place, right? And so, fascinatingly, they're working on incorporating climate literacy into the PISA tests. And so, I was talking to Andreas Schleicher the other day of the OECD, and his contention is that a very big component of climate literacy is personal agency. Um, really what you might call action civics, but an understanding of your own connectivity to what's going on in the world and your own ability to act on what's going on in the world. And that really, I think, shows an orientation that, yes, they need to understand the science. Yes, they need to understand that it's human cause. They also really need to understand the solutions, and they need to understand what they can do about it and how they can be part of the solutions. And that, I mean, you could easily imagine, and some schools are, you could reorient the entire educational effort around that set of challenges. It's that big, it's that systemic.
Pretty telling that it's the OECD and not an American institution that's coming up with these ideas.
It's
I
true.
agree. I mean, I always thought that the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN are also a great framework for thinking about these things because they basically all 17 of those goals are directly touching on climate change. I've done a lot
Mhm.
in my own classroom around responsible consumption and production. To your point, like how do you bring it down to a point where students can feel empowered that they can do something and not sort of doom scrolling and hearing um, that everything's going to hell,
Yeah.
particularly when you read that there are energy companies that actually promote that idea, right? They're trying to promote paralysis so that we
Yes.
don't do anything about it. And so, how do you overcome that and help students feel like, no, you don't have to solve the world's problems? You can do something at your own level.
So there's an educator's guide to climate emotions that I really recommend to teachers who are thinking about this, because I think, you can, all of the objections you raised are valid, right? The curriculum's overstuffed. There's not enough time. There's not enough resources. There's not enough training for teachers. But on top of that, teachers tell us that it's a big problem because students get upset when you talk about climate change.
Mm,
If you manage to break through and explain to them what's going on, it is scary and it is upsetting. And so this educator's guide is sort of full of ways to, in lesson plans, incorporate space for those feelings and expressions of them, as well as toggling back and forth between lessons that have sort of upsetting content and you know, things that are more reassuring. Because just as your principal said, I mean, you can't be talking about the wildfires all day long. It's just it's too much. It's too real.
yeah. What do you think is the most important idea that teens today need to understand about climate change?
Ooh,
I
that's a
mean,
really good question.
yeah, and maybe it's too big, and I can just edit this out if it was a bad question. But I guess what I'm kind of going with this is
Yeah,
there's so many. It's because you said it's what was the term you used? It's the
hyper object.
hyper object, right? I was thinking
Yeah,
polycrisis, but that's another one you
yeah,
use. Um,
right.
what we if you had to, uh,
If there's one thing I wish
yeah,
that every teen understood, I would say that every fraction of a degree of warming that is preventable is going to be worth preventing.
mm,
I think that there's so you know that sort of statement, unpacking that, understanding we're talking about average degrees of warming. We're talking about, yes, there's thresholds, but also we need to prevent every single piece of warming that we can, and that this is the effort and this is the urgency. Um, that's I think that's sort of the core message.
yeah, okay. Um, Sorry to drop that on you.
No, it's a great question.
I was stepping back for a second. I was talking about doom scrolling, and um, the amount of misinformation, disinformation,
Yeah,
crazy information that's out there. And I'm a huge fan of Mike Caulfield. I know
yeah,
you are too, and his SIFT method. Um, how does that resonate when you talk with people about how to handle misinformation, young people, but also adults?
yeah.
And whether you're talking about the SIFT method or other ways of processing, do you feel like, again, kind of back to this idea that we're just getting more or not taking anything out?
Yeah.
How do you feel like people are processing the information landscape?
I think people are struggling. I think that it seems like a large proportion of Americans are becoming deliberate or semi-deliberate news avoiders.
Mm,
You know, it's really interesting to think about, you know, media regimes kind of rise and fall with technology, and that's happened for generations, right? So clearly, obviously, people in the Middle Ages were quite misinformed, and
mhm,
in the American Revolution times, I mean, what percentage of people actually could read and follow what was going on in the Constitutional Convention? You know, otherwise, what was people's main source of information? Maybe somebody, you know, gossiping at the
yeah,
town tavern.
sure.
And then you had the penny dreadful newspapers, right? You had basically rags telling scandal sheets and this and that. And then then there was perhaps a golden age that people imagine as being, right? But I mean, you had Father Coughlin in the 30s
Mhm,
just spewing propaganda across the entire country, horrible racist propaganda
yeah,
that most people believed. And then you had okay, maybe for like a few decades there was television news. It was still super censored. It was like exactly what the US government wanted it to say. It wasn't that independent. And then newspapers, you know, got pretty serious, and there was, you know, there was nightly news. So then at least people are tuning into the same like 15 minutes of information on a nightly basis.
mm,
Um, and then we had this, you know, explosion of then there's cable news, 24 hours news cycle, whether there's 24 hours of news or not. There's a 24-hour news cycle. And coming up to today. So I think there's always been some great journalism, great storytelling, at least for the last few generations. And there's always been a lot of nonsense because people like nonsense. And so I don't think there's like a single golden age of maximum informed or educated population that we can compare it to. Um, But it's still clear to say that yes, there are people now are being in the position of being overwhelmed by too much information. Even if it's true, it's not always relevant or important.
Yeah, I saw somewhere that every day we encounter, not that we can process, but we encounter more information than a person in the Middle Ages would have encountered in their entire life.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but I wonder, though, to what extent it feels more, this era feels more cynical. There's less trust. Back to
Hmm.
Mike Caulfield for a second. He has this line that I come back to a lot, even with my own students. He said, you have to think of media trust like a currency. He said,
Hmm.
you have to be careful where you spend it, but you have to spend it, because if you decided that nothing can be trusted, you're exposing yourself to all kinds of misinformation. You have to kind of figure out where those trust points can be. And I wonder, do you feel like one of the characteristics of media today is we just don't trust it?
Absolutely. And I would like to point out that that's a classic strategy of authoritarianism as well.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in college, I visited Moscow for a summer, and it was publicly announced that there would be no hot water in certain sections of the city because they had to clean the pipes. Um, but that was obviously not true. It was because they didn't have enough energy to
Mm-hmm.
heat the water, and everyone knew that that was the real fact of it. And I was so puzzled to be in a place where that there was a public lie that everyone was supposed to just accept as a fact.
Mm-hmm.
But when the government is lying habitually to people,
Yeah.
it produces this cynicism that you're talking about and the mistrust, and it leads people to be very ill informed because they mistrust absolutely everything they hear. They don't know when to trust anything, so they don't trust anything, and then they don't know anything because they don't believe anything.
Yeah. And we see that play out in so many places. When we're having someone being confirmed for a cabinet position, and when we know
Yeah,
that everyone sitting in that confirmation hearing knows that person's unqualified, but we also know that person's going to be qualified, or not
right.
qualified, I'm sorry, confirmed. We
They're
know
gonna.
that person's not qualified. They know it, but we also know they're going to be confirmed. Um, to your point, which maybe, is a good time to talk about one of my favorite websites. And I think one of your favorite websites, Wikipedia,
It's true. I love Wikipedia.
which is, and I'm not even being facetious here. I mean, I think Wikipedia is the greatest website. It's not even close. But it
Yeah,
speaks to collective human action, a desire to learn, a desire to work together to get
yeah,
something right,
yeah,
um, to be creative, uh, in a collaborative way. And I know
yeah,
you think a lot about Creative Commons and these, you know, particularly when it comes to AI and how the intersection of these. But
yeah.
um, I don't know. There's not even a question here. I just wanted to talk about Wikipedia for a second.
Wikipedia is amazing. An interesting thing I've seen crop up in the last 3 weeks are volunteer data collectors. So people that are downloading information from government websites that they've been trying to obfuscate or hide or just take down,
Mm,
and then putting it back up on publicly hosted sites. It's almost like a renaissance of some of the open source
yeah.
hacking of the decade and a half ago, which you love to see. And you love to see that because it's really I mean, we've lived through an enclosure of the internet, right, where all of these platforms are fully monetized,
Mm,
and the user experience gets worse and worse. And there's an alternate way that this could go because we have HTTPS, right? We have these a web that could belong to everybody, a web that
mm.
can be non-commercial, and that can be be interactive without being forced to rely on these platforms. And so thinking about that as an alternative and using those kinds of things does give me a lot of hope and excitement.
Yeah, they're having a cool conversation on this podcast, Tech Won't Save Us,
Oh yeah.
and they were talking about Spotify, but they spent the host spent a lot of time talking about the age of like the Pirate Bay and these times when music
Hmm.
was just sort of flying around. And
Hmm.
I mean, back to the beginning of this conversation, we're talking about capitalism,
Yeah.
and exactly, you have this. In some ways, to me, Wikipedia represents that idea that we don't need to enclose things, as you say,
Yeah.
that we don't things don't have to be perfectly lined up. They don't have to be uh, monetized. They don't have to be. The purpose doesn't have to be growth. The purpose doesn't have to be profit. Um,
Right. Right.
and that just trying to pull all these threads together here because in
Yeah.
school, this is also a message that I feel like standardization, capitalism wants standardization.
Yeah.
And I think when we can look to examples that push back against that, we're healthier as humans, if that makes any sense.
Definitely. Absolutely. And I think that just looking to examples is one thing, but also just noticing and experiencing the amount of things you're doing in a day that have nothing to do with the marketplace. I mean, I don't know any teacher who sees their job as just being a job.
Yeah.
You're hosting a community, you're part of a web of relationships, and you're overseeing people's growth and challenge, and none of that really can. I mean, even if it were paid adequately, it wouldn't come down to a paycheck. It couldn't be captured that way.
Mm, yeah. How much of a threat our to this non-standardization is this idea of collective, more organic way of seeing the world? How much of a threat is AI to that? Do you think?
AI is stressful to me because I mean, I think that I think the capitalistic lens, and I've been paying a lot of attention to Ed Zitron's
Mm,
criticisms
mm,
recently. The capitalistic lens is probably the easiest way of understanding AI in the sense that just the tech industry needed a bubble. And so they pushed a lot of money into this and they made a lot of promises and a lot of hype that really didn't match the payoff. Um, and large language models, I mean, artificial intelligence in terms of algorithms and machine learning are real and they're in our world right now. They don't have the potential to capture the amount of economic growth that the investments in them suggest that they do. I just don't believe it. I think general intelligence is BS. I just don't think
mm,
it's going to happen
mm,
in any real way. And so, but what is happening is it is disrupting education, not because it's so great for teaching, but because it is challenging to certain kinds of assignments, right? It's giving students a very easy way to cheat on things that used to be seen as not easy to cheat on.
yeah,
And that's very disruptive. And the results of that, I think, are still kind of unwritten.
for sure. I think it does. I think one nice thing about AI's disruption in education, though, is it has made us look very closely at what we're asking students to do.
Yes.
What are we measuring? I think teachers that were already creating learning experiences and assignments that were more reflective, that were more personal, they suddenly found themselves like way ahead because they
Yes.
weren't the ones being assaulted by the teacher saying, "I don't get it." Like they're just turning in Chat GPT. Yeah, well, you're just giving them an essay question that they could plug in.
Right.
Maybe it's time to rethink that. But how do
Right.
you feel as a person, as a creative person, knowing that these LLMs have just like trawled the internet for intellectual property?
Um, I think that, I mean, it doesn't feel great. It is part of the devaluing of writing work that's happened for a long time. I mean, when I started writing 20 years ago, $2 a word was a good rate. And today it still is.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there's been a real a real issue when it comes to supply and demand for people that write for a living, and that's just in the that's outside of the realm of books. I mean, the proliferation of books and self publishing and Amazon Kindle Direct is just a whole other can of worms. But so that's been very hard. And then yes, AI is another level on top of that where it seems to be replacing kind of the most it replaces writing that people don't care about. I would say that that's, and that is too bad. But at the same time, it perhaps shifts your perception of what it is that you really do care about. And I think, just as you said, in the context of a teacher's assignment, it's like, well, that challenges me then to produce the things that only I can produce. Because if it's something generic, then that can be produced generically.
Yeah. I don't, at this point, I don't see AI as a highly valuable classroom tool. As a
Yeah.
teacher, it does just cool stuff like kind of organizing information and consolidating some things. I
Hmm.
know there's the next frontier seems to be AI tutors.
Right.
And I my initial, I actually talked with someone recently about this on this podcast, and she was very excited about this possibility. And I'm pretty skeptical of what kind of tutoring this would be. But then I also sometimes feel like I need to check myself, and I wonder if am I just coming at this from a perspective of privilege, feeling like, but maybe there are students that this technology really could help, even if it's imperfect, um, and that I don't want to just dismiss it because I feel like, well, I know what good feedback and tutoring looks like. Um, but I know you have thoughts on AI tutoring. I've heard you.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit. I mean, we've been down this road before
Mm,
about this idea of automating teaching, right?
yeah.
And I think what it continues to misunderstand is what is the role of the teacher, especially when a student is struggling? Encouragement, motivation, making
Mm.
them believe that they can do it. And in engaging with a little animated character is not going to give you those things.
But it's so cute, Anya.
It can be so cute, and and parasocial relationships are real. And if your child is like Elmo's, like, yay, you did it, like
Yeah.
it can be a fraction of something, but it's just the tutor's not there to sort of tell you. I mean, part of it is, yes, giving you strategies for problem solving, but what's going to make you engage with those strategies? What's going to make you think that you can do those things?
Yeah.
It's going to be a person who cares about you.
Yeah. The emotional component of learning can't be overstated. And
Yeah.
on the screen with, as you said, Elmo, probably not going to get there.
I
Um,
mean, I was talking to a an in-home daycare provider, um, with a bunch of kids who are from newcomer immigrant families, and they have a much higher rate of referrals for developmental disabilities in the last few years since COVID. And the city doesn't have any therapists. She's like, and the woman is like, they have tablet therapists, but a 3-year-old's not going to learn from a tablet. Like, give me a break. You're going to give a 3-year-old speech therapy on a tablet? Like, she was just like completely dismissive of the idea. And I think that's the problem, right? Like,
yeah.
they have this inequity, and then you're giving a tablet as a way of addressing it. It doesn't work.
And that's back to this, resilience without a network. I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen this, I've experienced this therapy online, and it's
Yeah.
just, it just doesn't work. I mean, I'll just speak for myself, but, and my
Mhm.
own son did speech therapy. They wanted to do it online. Well, we have this online option. We don't have the resources, to necessarily have face to face all the time. And it's like, that sucks because that face to face is exactly what it needs to be.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
It's really tricky. I mean, I live in that world. I live in a world of Zooms, and
yeah,
I also have been to a Zoom therapist, and I feel like yeah, I mean, there's such a desire, I think, for human beings to try to find that easy way and bridge the gap. And it's like it's very close to being what you want it to
yeah,
be,
it
but
is
there are
close.
these
Yeah,
there are these factors missing, and yeah, it's tricky.
yeah. What's your next project?
I am working on a book about the emotional landscape of the polycrisis.
Hmm.
Um, so really, it's about sort of uh, the paradigm for sanity or stability or happiness. Maybe I think needs to be a little bit different in the world we're living in, and I sort of liken it to a gyroscope where instead of like you go along and you hit an obstacle and then you keep going. It's like you're constantly spinning just to stay upright. And but I think there are tools and there are resources and worldviews and behaviors that we can use to actually thrive in this really, really difficult time.
Mm. Because it's not so linear. It's sort of around us all the time. Yeah.
It's all the time. Yeah.
Is this, do you come up with this idea that you pitch to a publisher, or does someone come to you and say, hey, Anya, we think this is something you could,
It can happen either way. At this
yeah,
right now, I'm working with an agent
cool.
who's going to take the book out to publishers. Yeah,
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see that. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Just, you're such an interesting thinker, and I appreciate you kind of going down these rabbit holes with me.
it was really fun, Dan. I bet your students really love you.
Well, hopefully.
Seems
Awesome.
like you're interested in all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Um, yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, that's I know you're busy, and it's just fun to talk about. This is kind of how my podcast rolls. We start somewhere and just kind of see where it goes, and I appreciate you being someone that thinks that way. Cool. All right. Thanks so much. All right. Take care. Bye.